He says, after true contrition comes joy. A sign of true contrition is when one is later truly happy. So we can experience this on an instantaneous level right away in situations where our selfish, egotistical self wants to assert itself. And just at that very moment, it's not a great adjustment. It's actually a very small adjustment. We just say, oh, and we admit that the situation requires it, that we are wrong. We promptly admit it, accept it. The situation doesn't require any kind of admission. We just note it to ourselves or to God, and we let it go. And immediately the situation, what happens is, the reason why we have responded in a way which is selfish or aggressive or hostile or dismissive or insensitive or whatever is because we have felt cramped. In the very next instant, what will happen is we will feel twice or three times more space open up. And that's a joyful experience. We find space. Suddenly there's time and space. Person who calls you on the phone that you really, really dread talking to, you pick up the phone, you go, oh gosh, and then at that moment, if you perform this small little bit of spiritual calculus, what will immediately happen is you'll relax and you'll have a good conversation. Even if you've never had a good conversation with this person before, something will shift, something will happen, something will improve, and there will be more space. That's the short term. The mid-range happens in a single extended practice period, and that's when we actually set out to do. In 12-step programs, people actually do a nightly inventory. This is a very ancient practice. Ibn al-Arabi, one of the great Sufi masters of all time, when he was a young boy, went to one of his Sufi masters to study and said he really wanted to draw close to God. And his Sufi master said, rise in the night and take out your notebook and write down in it everything that has happened during the day, and write next to that thing how you feel about it, good or bad. Do this night after night. This was his only instruction to Ibn al-Arabi. It became one of the great, great Sufi saints of all times, one of the great, great Sufi mystics. So this is a practice that, the 12-step people have developed, but they really took it from much older sources. It's been around for a very, very long time. A review of conscience, an examinin, some people call it. So this is something that happens during a particular period of practice. It can happen during prayer or meditation. I do it in the middle of the night. You can do it before you go to bed. Some people do it on waking, but between your bed and your coffee, not a lot happens. You can go wrong. I've done it. You can go wrong between your bed and coffee, but there's not a lot to talk about. By the end of the day, there is. So sometime later on in the day, if we do this, what we will experience is, again, space. We will pour out these things. You can write them down, or you can simply note them, or think about them, or review them. You'll remember the important things, and as time goes on, you'll remember more and more. And as time goes on, you'll have less to remember because you will practice this instantaneous practice on the spot. You will see where you're going wrong during the day, and you will correct it even as you go along, and so your days will be generally more joyful. Then there comes the long term. This is the course of an entire spiritual life, an entire life of spiritual practice. And what this means is that if we front load a certain amount of self-examination, the reward is the joy of self-knowledge, the joy of self-knowledge. Now, a word about this term, self-knowledge. A lot of people, when they hear that, they think like, Yogananda Fellowship or self-realization or something like that, and it's very easy to get a very inflated sort of notion about what that might mean, self-realization. Self-realization and self-knowledge are not exactly the same, and they often get confused. Self-knowledge is, generally speaking, the knowledge of one's own limited being, okay? Self-knowledge is a knowledge that we cast a shadow, each and every one of us. If we step out into the sunlight, our bodies, just because we have them, cast a shadow on the ground. The shadow has the same shape as our body. one side of our body is covered with light, the shadow stretches out beside us. It has the same shape we do, the same contours. And the spiritual logic of that is that if we are incarnated in a body with a life, with actual relationships to the world and other people, then we will accrue certain kinds of karmic debts. Okay, we'll be indebted to people and to situations. We're indebted only to the food we eat and the bodies of other living creatures, plants and animals that we consume. We're all part of one seamless whole, where everything that eats is eaten, everything is born and dies for everything else. And by virtue of our embedment in that natural process, we cast a shadow. When we look at that shadow and accept it, we find that it is surrounded by light. That's the beautiful thing about it. A shadow can't exist without being embraced by light. Shadow only exists right next to light. The shadow only exists because light is pressed up against it as close can be. Sometimes look at the line between a shadow and sunlight, especially a very sharply defined shadow, like on a summer day. Look outside and put your hand outside and put it close to the ground so that you don't get a diffuse shadow, but a really dark shadow. And you can see where it is, and you can look at that shadow and see. And the space between the light and that shadow is the space that exists between a baby and a mother's breast. It is no space at all. No space whatsoever. And it's very comforting and very beautiful, but we only experience that if we look at the shadow. Otherwise we don't. The great irony is we do not experience light on its own. We do not experience light on its own. Rebbe Nachman's way of explaining that is to say that after great contrition or sincere contrition comes great joy. So over the course of an entire spiritual life, what that means is that the degree to which we are, especially in the early stages of spiritual practice, and in my case, I guess the early stages are about 33 years, because I started when I was 19 and I'm now 52. I'm feeling like I'm just now finally sort of leaving the first stages of practice and entering the middle stages. So if we are willing to look at ourselves and our actions and our place in the world and our relationships with other people, then we are building the foundation for a temple of light. What's the foundation for a temple of light? The shadow. Lift it up and the shadow is underneath it. Always. Lift up anything and there's a shadow right under it. Okay? As close can be, supporting it. There's no light without that shadow. And that's what Rebbe Nachman's teaching us for the week.